You need to leave my property right now." Barbara's face turned crimson as she pointed at the survey stakes. "I don't care what your little papers say. I've been using this land for 15 years. The professional surveyor just smiled and pointed at his GPS equipment. "Ma'am, according to county records and our measurements, you're standing 23 feet inside Mr. Harrison's property line." What happened next would expose the biggest HOA fraud scheme our county had ever seen. My father's last words to me weren't, "I love you" or "I'm proud of you." They were, "Mark, whatever you do, don't sell the Mitchell property. There's something important about that land." He died 3 days later, and I spent the next 8 years wondering what he meant. My name is Mark Harrison, and I'm a civil engineer, specializing in land surveying and property development. When my father passed away in April of 2016, he left me a modest inheritance, including a 3-acre parcel of land in Meadowbrook Estates, an upscale planned community about 40 minutes outside of Denver. The property had been in our family since I'd been so busy with my career and raising my 2 daughters that I honestly forgot about the property. I paid the annual property taxes, about $2,300 a year, but never actually visited the land. It was just another item on my financial spreadsheet, a legacy from my father that I never quite understood. Everything changed in March of 2024. I received a certified letter from the Metabrook Estates Homeowners Association. The letter, signed by one Barbara Whitmore, HOA President, informed me that I was in violation of several community covenants. According to Barbara, my neglected lot was an eyesore. I had failed to maintain the community garden space, and I owed $17,500 in back HOA fees and fines. I stared at the letter in confusion. Community garden space. I owned raw land. There were no structures, no improvements, nothing that could possibly violate any covenants, and $17,500 in fees. I'd never even received a previous notice. I decided it was time to actually visit this mysterious property my father had left me. The drive to Meadowbrook Estates took me through increasingly affluent neighborhoods. The community itself was beautiful, perfectly manicured lawns, expensive vehicles in every driveway, homes that easily started at $750,000. The HOA entrance had an elaborate stone gateway with the community name in bronze letters. I pulled up to the address listed on my property deed, 40 Sioux 73 Metabrook Lane. What I found made my blood run cold. The lot wasn't empty at all. There was an elaborate garden with a decorative fountain, a large gazebo, professionally landscaped flower beds, and even a small greenhouse. Stone pathways wound through the space, and there were several expensive leek-and garden sculptures. This wasn't some community space. This was someone's personal garden paradise, and that someone was about to arrive. A white Cadillac Escalade pulled into the driveway of the house next door, a massive colonial-style home that had to be worth well over $1 million. A woman in her late 50s stepped out, wearing designer athleisure wear and oversized sunglasses. She was carrying Starbucks in one hand and her phone in the other. She froze when she saw me standing on her garden path. "Excuse me, but this is private property," she called out, her voice dripping with authority. "This garden space is maintained by the HOA for the exclusive use of adjacent property owners. You're trespassing." I smiled politely. "Actually, ma'am, I own this property. I'm Mark Harrison. I believe you sent me a letter." Her face went through several shades of red before settling on a deep crimson. You're the Harrison who owns the empty lot." "It doesn't look very empty to me," I said, gesturing at the elaborate garden around us. "In fact, it looks like someone has built quite an impressive setup on my land." Barbara's demeanor shifted instantly from shocked to aggressive. She marched toward me, her designer heels clicking on the stone pathway she'd built on my property. "Now you'll listen here," she said, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "That land has been maintained by this community for 15 years. Your father abandoned it. We've paid for all these improvements, and the community has benefited from this space. You can't just show up after all this time and what?" I interrupted. "Expect to have access to my own property. The property I've been paying taxes on for 8 years. "Taxes," she scoffed. You think paying a few $1,000s a year entitles you to disrupt an entire community? We've invested over $80,000 in improvements here. The fountain alone cost $12,000. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos. So you're admitting that you've made unauthorized improvements on someone else's private property? Barbara's eyes widened. Stop that. You can't just take pictures of HOA community space. It's not HOA community space. Primera Said, calmly continuing to photograph the gazebo, the greenhouse, and the elaborate landscaping. It's my private property. And unless you can show me a deed that says otherwise, you're the one who's trespassing. What happened next was my first glimpse of the real Barbara Whitmore. She pulled out her phone and made a call, never taking her eyes off me. Yes, this is Barbara Whitmore, HOA President of Meadowbrook Estates. I need security. 242-73 Metabrook Lane. Immediately. We have a trespasser who's refusing to leave community property. He's becoming aggressive. I wasn't being aggressive at all. I was simply standing on my own land, taking pictures. But I quickly realized this was a woman who was used to getting her way. Within 10 minutes, a private security vehicle arrived. 2 guards got out, both looking uncertain when they saw a middle-aged man in khakis and a polo shirt calmly taking photographs. Ma'am, one of them addressed Barbara. This man is trespassing on HOA property, Barbara declared. I need him removed immediately. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded document, my property deed. Gentlemen, I'm Mark Harrison. I own this 3-acre parcel, as documented in this deed recorded with Jefferson County. I'm not trespassing. I'm standing on my own property. The security guards looked at each other, then at the deed, then at Barbara. Ma'am, the older guard said carefully, if he has a deed showing he owns this property, we can't remove him. This would be a civil matter, not a security issue. Barbara's face went from red to nearly purple. I am the HOA President. This is community property. It's been designated as such for 15 years. Then you should have no problem showing me the deed that transferred ownership from my father to the HOA, I said evenly, because I have the original deed, and I have 8 years of property tax receipts showing continuous ownership. What do you have? The silence that followed was deafening. This isn't over, Barbara finally hissed. The HOA board will be hearing about this. You'll be sued for disrupting community amenities. You'll pay back every cent we've invested in this space, and you'll never get approval for any development on this land. I'll make sure of that. She turned and stormed back to her Cadillac, the security guards trailing behind her apologetically. I stood alone in the garden that shouldn't exist, on the property my father told me never to sell, and I realized something important. My father had known. Somehow, he'd known about this situation, and that's why he'd held on to this land for decades. That's why his last words had been a warning. Over the next week, I did what any good engineer would do. I researched. I discovered that Meadowbrook Estates HOA had been established in 17 years after my father purchased the land. The original HOA covenants made no mention of my father's parcel because it predated the community and was never part of the HOA. I also discovered something interesting. There were no records of any easement, no records of any agreement between my father and the HOA, and no records of the HOA ever paying my father anything for use of the land. They had simply assumed they could take it. Barbara had been HOA president for 12 years. She lived in the house directly adjacent to my property, and based on property records, her home's value had increased by approximately $350,000 since she'd built her community garden on my land. That's when I decided to fight back. I hired the best property surveying firm in Colorado, Precision Land Surveys, the same company I'd worked with on several engineering projects. I paid them $4,500 to conduct a complete boundary survey of my 3-acre parcel, using GPS technology and comparing it against the original property description from 19... The survey was scheduled for May 15th, 2024. I didn't tell Barbara it was coming. The morning of the survey, I arrived at the property at 7 o'clock. The survey crew was already setting up their equipment. By 7:30, Barbara had come storming out of her house in her bathrobe. "What the hell is going on here?" se demanded. The lead surveyor, A professional named Tom Chun smiled politely. "We're conducting a boundary survey for Mr. Harrison." "Ma'am." Barbara's face drained of color. "You can't do that. This is community property." "I'll call the police." "Ma'am, you're welcome to call anyone you'd like," Tom said calmly. "But we have a valid contract with the property owner, and we're operating with all required permits." For the next 3 hours, Barbara stood in her driveway, making phone calls and watching with increasing agitation as the survey crew set up GPS receivers, drove stakes, and carefully mapped out the property boundaries. At 11:45, Tom approached me with his tablet, showing me the preliminary results. "Mr. Harrison," he said, "I think you need to see this." What he showed me changed everything. The property line didn't just include the garden area where Barbara had built her fountain and gazebo. According to the GPS coordinates and the original property description, my property line extended 43 feet past the garden and included a substantial portion of what Barbara had been using as her personal backyard. Her pool house, her outdoor kitchen, half of her pool deck. All of it was on my property. Tom walked over to where Barbara was standing, and I followed. He held up his tablet, showing the survey results. "Ma'am," he said professionally, "I need to inform you that according to our survey, this property line extends to approximately this point." He indicated a spot about 20 feet behind where she was standing, "which means you're currently standing on Mr. Harrison's property." The sound that came out of Barbara's mouth wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a gasp. It was something in between, a noise of pure, unadulterated panic. "That's impossible!" she shrieked. "My pool has been there for 10 years. My pool house cost $65,000. You people don't know what you're doing." Tom remained calm. "Ma'am, we use the same GPS technology that guides commercial aircraft. Our margin of error is less than 3 centimeters. These coordinates match the original property description filed in 1970. Your improvements don't change where the property line is located." "This is insane." Barbara was now pacing back and forth. "I've lived here for 18 years. The HOA approved all of my improvements. The county approved them. Everyone KNEW where the property lines were." "Actually," I said quietly, pulling out another document, "according to Jefferson County records, you never pulled a permit for your pool house, and your pool permit from 2014 shows a setback of 15 feet from the property line, but it doesn't specify which property line you measured from." Barbara stared at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "You did this on purpose," she whispered. "You planned this whole thing?" "No," I corrected her. "You built structures on someone else's property and assumed you'd never be caught. That's not planning. That's theft." What I didn't know at that moment was that Barbara had a much bigger secret than just building on my land, and when her secret came out, it would bring down not just her, but the entire HOA board. Has anyone else dealt with an HOA that tried to steal their property? Drop your stories in the comments below. I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's dealt with HOA overreach. When the surveyor told Barbara that her $65,000 pool house was actually on my property, I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. What we discovered next would reveal that Barbara hadn't just stolen my land. She'd been running a systematic scheme that had defrauded over 30 homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates, and the evidence was literally buried in my backyard. The day after the survey, I received not one but THREE certified letters. The first was from Barbara Ray's personal attorney, demanding that I cease and desist from harassing his client and threatening legal action if I continued to make false claims about property boundaries. The second was from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board, officially notifying me that I was being fined $500 per day for disrupting community harmony and unauthorized survey activities on community property. The third was the most interesting. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, Blackstone and Associates, and it informed me that they represented multiple parties with interest in the disputed parcel and that I should contact them immediately to discuss a reasonable settlement. I called my own attorney, a real estate lawyer named Sarah Chen, who I'd worked with on several development projects. When I explained the situation, there was a long pause on the phone. "Mark," she said carefully, This sounds like a quiet tidal action waiting to happen. But before we go nuclear, let me do some research. Something about this doesn't smell right. She was right to be suspicious. Over the next week, Sarah dug into the property records, HOA documents, and community history of Meadowbrook Estates. What she found was stunning. My father's property wasn't the only parcel that predated the HOA. There were actually 9 original properties that existed before Meadowbrook Estates was developed. 8 of those properties had been purchased by the HOA Development Company between 1990 and 1995, consolidated, and then subdivided into the current community layout. My father's 3 acres was the only original parcel that had never been sold. But here's where it got interesting. According to the HOA Master Deed filed in 19ALL, land within the community boundaries was supposed to be either privately owned residential lots or HOA common areas. There was no provision for independent parcels like mine. Someone had simply assumed my father's land was part of the HOA and had treated it that way for nearly 30 years. And Barbara, who had been on the HOA board since 2004 and president since 2012, had actively encouraged this misunderstanding. Sarah scheduled a formal meeting with the HOA board for June 3, 2024. She told them to bring their attorney, their property records, and any documentation showing they had legal right to use my land. The meeting was held at the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center, a beautiful building that probably cost the homeowners a fortune. When Sarah and I arrived, we found not just the 5-member HOA board, but also 12 other residents who had apparently been invited to observe the proceedings. Barbara sat at the center of the board table, flanked by her attorney, a nervous-looking man in his 30s named Derek Palmer, and the other board members. She had clearly dressed for battle. A severe black business suit, her hair pulled back tightly, and an expression that could freeze water. "Mr. Harrison," Barbara began formally, "we've agreed to this meeting in the spirit of community cooperation. However, I want to make it clear that the HOA's position has not changed. Your survey is flawed, your claims are baseless, and your behavior has been disruptive to our entire community." Sarah smiled pleasantly and opened her briefcase. "Ms. Whitmore, before we discuss my client's survey, I'd like to ask you a simple question. Do you have a deed showing that the Meadowbrook Estates HOA owns the property located at 4273 Meadowbrook Lane?" Derek Palmer cleared his throat. "The property in question has been maintained as community space for over 15 years. Under Colorado adverse possession laws, adverse possession requires 20 years of continuous, open, and hostile use." Sarah interrupted smoothly, "And it requires that the property taxes be paid by the adverse possessor, not the legal owner. Mr. Harrison has been paying property taxes continuously since 2016, and his father paid them for 38 years before that. So, adverse possession doesn't apply here." Barbara's face was already turning red. "We have invested substantial resources into that property. The community has benefited from our improvements. There must be some compensation for 4 building structures on someone else's land without permission." Sarah pulled out a thick folder. "Let's talk about those structures. According to Jefferson County building records, you never pulled permits for the gazebo, the greenhouse, or the garden fountain. You did pull a permit for your pool house in 2014, but you listed the setback measurements from YOUR property line, not Mr. Harrison's. That permit was based on fraudulent information." The room went very quiet. "That's absurd," Derek Palmer said quickly. "My client acted in good faith, based on the understood property boundaries at the time." Sarah pulled out another document. "This is a survey of Ms. Whitmore's property, conducted in 2013, 1 year before she built her pool house. This survey clearly shows the property line between her lot and the adjacent parcel, which is my client's property." Ms. Whitmore had actual knowledge of where the real property line was located. Barbara stood up abruptly. "This is a witch hunt. You're trying to destroy me because I've been an effective HOA president. Every decision I've made has been for the good of this community." "Then you won't mind explaining this," Sarah said, sliding a spreadsheet across the table. What Sarah had discovered would change everything. While researching the HOA records, Sarah had noticed something odd. Over the past 12 years, The HOA had conducted property line adjustments for 7 different homeowners in the community. In each case, the HOA had purchased small strips of land from adjacent common areas, allowing homeowners to expand their yards or build additions to their homes. The prices paid for these land strips ranged from $5,000 to $25,000. But here's the problem. None of those common areas were actually owned by the HOA. They were all portions of the original 9 parcels that predated the community. And 6 of those parcels had specific deed restrictions that prevented subdivision or piecemeal sale. Barbara had been selling land the HOA didn't own. One of the board members, a man named Robert Chen, picked up the spreadsheet with shaking hands. "Barbara, what is this?" "It's a misunderstanding," Barbara said quickly. "Those were legitimate transactions approved by the board." "I never approved any land sales," Robert said, his voice rising. "We voted on easements and fence, but never on selling HOA property." Another board member, a woman named Patricia Gonzalez, was scrolling through her phone. "Barbara, I'm looking at the minutes from the March 2020 meeting. You told us we were voting on boundary maintenance agreements, not land sales." Barbara laughs nervously. The mask was starting to crack. "This is taken out of context," Barbara insisted. "I've always acted in the community's best interest. These technical details are being twisted to make me look bad." Sarah pulled out yet another document. "This is a bank record for an account in the name of Meadowbrook Community Improvement Fund. According to these statements, this account has received deposits totaling $173,000 over the past 12 years. Can you tell us where that money came from?" Derek Palmer was now sweating visibly. "My client is not required to answer financial questions without proper notice. Those are the payments from the property sales," Robert said, staring at Barbara. "Where is that money? Why isn't it in the HOA's main accounts?" Barbara's expression was now one of barely controlled panic. "That account is for special projects. It's completely legitimate. You people are acting like I have committed some kind of crime." "Embezzlement is a crime," Sarah said quietly. "And so is fraud. Mr. Palmer, I'd advise your client to stop talking." The room erupted in chaos. Board members were shouting questions at Barbara. The observers were pulling out their phones, presumably texting other residents. Derek Palmer was frantically whispering to Barbara, who kept shaking her head and saying, "No, no, no." I sat there in stunned silence, realizing that my father's mysterious warning about the property had been even more prescient than I'd imagined. He must have known something was wrong with how the HOA was operating. He'd held onto that land as a safeguard, a tripwire that would eventually expose the truth. Finally, Barbara grabbed her purse and stood up. "I don't have to listen to these accusations. This meeting is over." "Actually," Sarah said calmly, "we have one more item to discuss. Mr. Harrison has received a preliminary title report on his property. There appears to be an unauthorized easement filed in 2017 that grants the HOA access to his land for utility maintenance purposes. Were you aware of this easement, Ms. Whitmore?" Barbara froze halfway to the door, because according to Colorado law, Sarah continued, filing a false easement on someone else's property is a Class 5 felony, and the signature on that easement filing, it's yours. What happened next happened fast. Barbara bolted from the room, her heels clicking rapidly down the hallway. Derek Palmer gathered his papers and followed, muttering apologies. The remaining board members sat in stunned silence, looking at each other with expressions of horror and betrayal. Robert Chen was the first to speak. "How much of the HOA's finances has she been controlling?" Patricia pulled out her laptop. "I'm looking at the annual reports she's given us. If this secret account exists, then our reserves should be much higher than what she's been reporting." Over the next 2 hours, the board members and I went through every financial document Sarah had obtained through public records requests. The picture that emerged was damning. Barbara had been running a sophisticated embezzlement scheme for over a decade. She'd sold portions of land the HOA didn't own, pocketing $173,000. She'd inflated maintenance contracts and received kickbacks from vendors worth approximately $85,000. She'd charged special assessments for improvements that were never made, totaling $62,000. In total, Barbara Whitmore had stolen over $320,000 from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. But it got worse. There's something else. Patricia sighed, her face pale as she looked at her laptop screen. The community's insurance policy. Barbara told us it cost $42,000 a year. But I'm looking at the actual policy documents from the insurance company's website. It only costs $28,000 a year. She's been pocketing the difference, Robert said numbly. For how many years? At least 7, Patricia replied. That's another $98,000. We sat in silence, the magnitude of the fraud sinking in. Barbara Whitmore, the woman who had presented herself as the perfect HOA President, the guardian of community standards, had been systematically looting the community she claimed to serve. What do we do now? One of the other board members asked. Sarah closed her briefcase. Now you call the police, and then you call a forensic accountant. This isn't just civil fraud anymore. This is criminal. That evening, I drove back to my property. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across Barbara's elaborate garden, the garden she'd built on land she'd stolen from me, using money she'd stolen from her neighbors. I walked to the far corner of my 3 acres, to a spot I hadn't explored yet. There was an old oak tree there, probably 100 years old, with carved initials in the bark. I looked closer and felt my breath catch. The initials were my father's, carved in 19, and below them, carved in fresher wood, were different initials. She'd been coming to this property for decades, long before she'd started her garden project. This wasn't just about stealing land or embezzling money. This was personal in a way I didn't yet understand. My phone rang. It was Sarah. Mark, you need to hear this. I just got a call from a title company. In 2018, someone attempted to file a quiet title action on your property, claiming abandonment. The filing was rejected because your property taxes were current. But guess who filed the paperwork? Barbara, I said, though it wasn't really a question. Barbara, Sarah confirmed. She's been trying to steal your property for at least 6 years. Maybe longer. I looked at the carved initials on the tree, at Barbara's pool house, visible in the distance. And I made a decision. I wasn't just going to stop her. I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what she'd done. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. The first message was from Sarah. Turn on Channel 9 News. Now I turned on the TV and felt my blood run cold. There was aerial footage of my property. But something was different. During the night, someone had spray-painted bright red lines all across the garden, marking what appeared to be property boundaries. But these weren't the real boundaries from my survey. These fake boundary lines made it look like my property was twice as large as it actually was, and made it look like I was claiming ownership of 4 other people's backyards. The news anchor was talking about a property dispute in an exclusive Denver suburb and one man's attempt to seize community land. And there, being interviewed on camera, was Barbara Whitmore, tears streaming down her face, explaining how a greedy developer was trying to destroy their peaceful community. My phone rang. It was Sarah. Mark, we have a big problem. Barbara just filed a lawsuit against you for harassment, trespassing, and defamation. And so she's gotten 37 residents to sign a petition supporting her and demanding that you abandon your property claim. How is that possible? I asked, staring at the TV screen where Barbara was playing the victim perfectly. Everyone at that meeting heard the evidence. She's telling people that you faked the documents, Sarah said grimly. And she's claiming that your survey crew spread those fake boundary lines to make her look bad. I thought about those carved initials on the oak tree, about Barbara's decades-long obsession with my property, about her desperate attempts to steal what wasn't hers. Sarah, I said quietly, I think it's time we go to the FBI. What I didn't know was that the FBI was already investigating Barbara Whitmore, and what they'd found was going to shock everyone, including me. This is getting absolutely insane. Have you ever had someone try to frame you for something they did? Let me know in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone in dealing with this level of manipulation. Barbara had just gone on TV playing the victim, claiming I was a greedy developer trying to steal community land. 37 residents signed a petition against me. She'd even spray-painted fake property lines to make me look like the villain. But what Barbara didn't know was that the FBI had been watching her for 6 months, and the evidence they'd collected was about to bring down not just her, but an entire network of HOA fraud. Sarah scheduled an emergency meeting with the FBI's white-collar crime division in Denver. I honestly thought she was overreacting. Yes, Barbara had embezzled money and sold land she didn't own, but FBI level investigation seemed extreme. Primera, HOA es wrong. Special Agent Victoria Rodriguez met us in a nondescript office building in downtown Denver on June 10, 2024. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, and carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that made you sit up straight. "Mr. Harrison," she said, shaking my hand, "thank you for coming in. I understand you've been having some issues with Barbara Whitmore." "That's putting it mildly," I replied. Agent Rodriguez smiled slightly. "Before we discuss your situation, I need to show you something. What I'm about to share is part of an ongoing investigation, so I need your discretion." She opened a laptop and turned it toward us. On the screen was a photograph of Barbara Whitmore, but it wasn't recent. This photo was from approximately 15 years ago, and she was standing next to a man I didn't recognize. "This is Richard Whitmore, Barbara's ex-husband," Agent Rodriguez explained. "He was a real estate developer who was convicted of mortgage fraud in 2012. He served 4 years in federal prison. Barbara was never charged," the agent continued, "but we always suspected she was involved. After Richard went to prison, Barbara divorced him and moved to Meadowbrook Estates. She joined the HOA board within 6 months." Sarah leaned forward. "You think she's been running a similar scheme through the "We know she has," Agent Rodriguez said. "We've been investigating HOA fraud across Colorado for the past 18 months. Barbara Whitmore's operation is one of the most sophisticated we've seen. Your property survey actually accelerated our timeline. We were planning to move on her next month, but her reaction to your boundary dispute has forced her to make mistakes." She pulled up another document on her laptop. "Remember that secret bank account your attorney discovered? The Meadowbrook Community Improvement Fund. The one with $173,000. I asked. "That account currently holds $42,000. Agent Rodriguez said. "Where do you think?" The rest went. The implications hit me like a freight train. She's been spending it. Not just spending it. She's been investing it. We've traced money from that account to 4 different LLC shell companies. Those companies have purchased 3 residential properties in the past 5 years, all at foreclosure prices in communities where Barbara had connections to the HOA boards." Sarah's eyes widened. "She's been using stolen HOA funds to buy investment properties." "It gets better," Agent Rodriguez said grimly. "Those properties were then managed by a company called Premium Property Services." "Care to guess who owns Premium Property Services?" "Barbara's daughter," I guessed. "Close. Barbara's sister, Helen Whitmore, who conveniently lives in California and has no obvious connection to Barbara in public records. The rental income from those properties, approximately $8,000 per month total, goes to an account that Barbara controls." I felt sick. "How much money are we talking about in total?" "From Meadowbrook Estates alone, approximately $730,000 over 12 years. But we believe she's run similar schemes in at least 3 other communities. Our conservative estimate is that Barbara Whitmore has embezzled over $2 million from various HOA organizations." The room was silent, except for the hum of the laptop fan. "Why are you telling us this?" Sarah asks carefully. "If you're in the middle of an investigation." "Because Mr. Harrison's property survey has created an opportunity," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Barbara is panicking. She's making public statements, filing lawsuits, creating a paper trail. Most importantly, she's been contacting her co-conspirators." "Co-conspirators?" I repeated. Agent Rodriguez pulled up a chart showing names and connections. "Barbara doesn't work alone. She has a network of people who help facilitate these schemes. Friendly title company employees who lose documents, appraisers who undervalue properties, contractors who inflate bids and kick back the difference. We've identified 11 individuals in her network." She pointed to one name on the chart. Derek Palmer, Barbara's attorney. "Mr. Palmer has been particularly helpful to Barbara's operation. He's filed at least 17 quiet title actions on properties in various communities, always claiming abandonment or adverse possession. 8 of those actions were successful, resulting in properties being transferred to HOA control, and then mysteriously sold to Barbara's shell companies. So, what do you need from me?" I asked. "We need you to keep pushing," Agent Rodriguez said. "File a lawsuit over the property. Demand access to HOA financial records. Make no. The more pressure you put on Barbara, the more mistakes she make, and we'll be watching every move she makes." "You want to use me as bait?" I said flatly. "I want to use you as a catalyst," she corrected. "Barbara Whitmore has been stealing from communities for over a decade. She's destroyed HOA reserves, forced special assessments on innocent homeowners, and lined her pockets with money that should have gone to community maintenance. Someone needs to stop her." I thought about my father's warning, about the 37 residents who had signed Barbara's petition, not knowing they were defending a criminal, about the hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from people who trusted their HOA president. "Okay," I said. "What do we do first?" Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and I launched a full legal assault on Barbara Whitmore and the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. We filed a lawsuit demanding that all structures on my property be removed at Barbara's expense. The estimated cost, $95,000. Second, we filed a formal complaint with the Colorado HOA Regulatory Board, detailing every financial irregularity we'd discovered. Third, we demanded a complete forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 15 years. Barbara's response was immediate and vicious. She filed a counter-lawsuit claiming that my survey was fraudulent and that I owed the HOA $340,000 in damages for disrupting community operations. She also filed for a restraining order, claiming premedita they threatened her during the board meeting. A complete fabrication. The local news ate it up. Channel 9 ran a story titled, "Property Dispute Tears Apart Exclusive Community." Channel 4 interviewed several residents who supported Barbara, all of them repeating her talking points about greedy developers and community preservation. But then something unexpected happened. A resident named Michael Torres reached out to Sarah. Michael lived 4 houses down from Barbara and had been in the community since 2007. He'd attended the contentious board meeting and had heard the evidence against Barbara. I started looking through my old HOA documents. Michael told us when we met at a coffee shop, "Something Barbara said during the meeting bothered me. She mentioned approving my fence extension in 2019. And Sarah prompted, "I never got a fence extension approved in 2019, Michael said. "I asked for one, but Barbara told me it would cost $5,000 in HOA processing fees. I couldn't afford that, so I withdrew my request." He pulled out a bank statement. But according to this, someone made a $5,000 withdrawal from the HOA reserve account in April of 2019 with the notation, "Torres fence approval." That money was taken from community funds, not my personal account. Sarah and I exchanged glances. "Do you still have the original documentation from when you requested the fence extension?" "Better than that," Michael said. "I have an email from Barbara telling me the project was denied because it didn't meet setback requirements. That email is dated May 2nd, 2019. 3 weeks after the money was withdrawn from the reserve account, we had her." Michael wasn't the only one. Over the next week, 6 more residents came forward with similar stories. Special assessments for projects that never happened. Maintenance fees that kept increasing while actual maintenance declined. Insurance deductible payments that seemed excessive. The most damning evidence came from Patricia Gonzalez, the board member who had started questioning Barbara during our meeting. Patricia had spent 2 weeks going through every HOA financial record she could access. "The insurance fraud alone is staggering," Patricia told us, spreading documents across Sarah's conference table. "Barbara has been telling us our insurance costs $42,000 per year. The actual cost is $28,000. She's been doing this since 2017. That's $98,000. But it's worse than that," Patricia continued. I contacted our insurance broker directly. He told me that in 2022, he offered us a new policy that would save us $11,000 per year. Barbara told the board that she'd investigated it, and the coverage wasn't adequate, but there's no record of her ever investigating it. She just rejected it without explanation. She didn't want lower insurance costs, because then she couldn't skim as much, Sarah observed. Exactly, Patricia said. And there's more. Remember that major roof replacement project on the clubhouse in 2021? Barbara told us it would cost $135,000. She got 3 bids, and she showed the board the highest bid as the recommended contractor because they supposedly had the best references. Let me guess, I said. The contractor has connections to Barbara. Patricia nodded. The contractor is owned by Barbara's nephew, and I found the original bids in the archive files. The lowest legitimate bid was $87,000. Barbara steered the contract to her nephew's company and likely got a kickback on the $40,000 difference. The evidence was overwhelming, but we needed one more piece to make the case. Bulletproof. That piece came from the most unexpected source. Barbara's own husband, Charles Whitmore, had been married to Barbara for 23 years. He was a quiet man who worked as an accountant for a manufacturing company. According to Agent Rodriguez, he'd been completely unaware of his wife's criminal activities, until he wasn't. Charles showed up at Sarah's office on June 28, 2024. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I found something, he said quietly, setting a laptop on Sarah's desk. I wasn't snooping, I swear. I was looking for our tax returns from last year, and I found this. He opened a folder on the laptop, labeled Property Records. Inside were detailed spreadsheets, tracking every transaction Barbara had made through her shell companies, purchase prices, rental, income, maintenance expenses, property appreciation. It was a complete financial record of her entire criminal enterprise. There's more, Charles said, his voice shaking. There's a folder called Insurance Documents. She's been inflating our homeowners' insurance claims for years. Small stuff. A damaged fence that cost $800 to repair. But she claimed $3,000. A hail damage claim that was denied, but she told me it was paid out. He looked up at us with haunted eyes. How long has she been doing this? At least 12 years, Sarah said gently. Probably longer. Charles closed his eyes. I need to cooperate with the FBI. I need to make this right. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. We believe you, I said. And I did. Charles Whitmore was a victim too, married to a woman who had been lying to him for decades. On Yuli Fief 2024, the FBI executed search warrants on Barbara Whitmore's home, her sister's California residence, and the offices of Derek Palmer. The raid happened at 6 in the morning. I wasn't there, but Michael Torres sent me a video taken from his doorbell camera. You could see federal agents in FBI windbreakers surrounding Barbara's house. Barbara herself was led out in handcuffs, still in her bathrobe, screaming about her rights and demanding to speak to her attorney. The irony was that her attorney, Derek Palmer, was also being arrested at that exact moment. By noon, the news had spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire. The story was now on every major Denver news station. HOA President arrested and multi-million-dollar fraud scheme agent Rodriguez called me that evening. We found everything: financial records, forged documents, communication with co-conspirators. Barbara's house was like a criminal enterprise headquarters. She kept detailed records of every scam she ran. Why would she keep records? I asked, confused. Arrogance, Agent Rodriguez said simply. She thought she was too smart to get caught. She thought she had the system beaten. The charges against Barbara Whitmore included wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, filing false documents, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. She was facing up to 75 years in federal prison. But the story wasn't over yet. 2 days after Barbara's arrest, I received a phone call from Charles Whitmore. Mr. Harrison, he said, there's something I need to tell you. Something about your father. My blood ran cold. What about my father? Barbara knew him, Charles said, back in the 1980s, before we were married. She worked at a title company, and your father came in regarding some property he owned. Barbara tried to convince him to sell. He refused. She's been obsessed with that property ever since. That's why she built the garden, I said slowly. It wasn't just about stealing land. It was personal. There's more, Charles said. I found a letter in her files. A letter she wrote but never sent. In it, she talks about how your father humiliated her by refusing her offers. She says that one day she would take what should have been hers. The pieces finally clicked into place. My father hadn't just held onto the property as an investment. He'd held onto it because he knew Barbara would never stop trying to take it. It was his way of protecting not just his land, but potentially exposing her crimes. His last words to me, "Don't sell the Mitchell property," hadn't been about sentiment or family legacy. They'd been a warning about Barbara Whitmore, and in the end, my father had been right. Barbara's obsession with taking what wasn't hers had finally destroyed her. But what Barbara didn't know, what nobody knew, was that there was still one more secret buried on my property. And when the FBI forensic team discovered it, the case would become something much bigger than simple HOA fraud. The FBI found what on my property? You're not going to believe what happens in the final part. Drop a comment. If you think Barbara gets what she deserves, or if you think there's more to this story, Barbara Whitmore was arrested by the FBI, facing 75 years in prison for embezzling over $2 million. But when FBI forensic teams started excavating my property, they found something that turned a fraud case into something much darker. What they discovered buried beneath Barbara's elaborate garden would shock everyone. 3 days after Barbara's arrest, Agent Rodriguez called me with an unusual request. "Mr. Harrison, we need to excavate a portion of your property. Specifically, the area beneath the fountain Barbara built." "Why?" I asked, confused. "We found architectural drawings in Barbara's files," she explained. "Drawings that show underground storage chambers beneath that fountain. We need to know what's in them." On July 12, 2024, FBI forensic teams arrived with ground-penetrating radar and excavation equipment. What they found was stunning. Beneath Barbara's decorative fountain was a concrete vault, approximately 8 feet by 12 feet. Inside were 73 Banger's boxers containing documents, hard drives, and cash. The documents detailed not just Barbara's crimes, but an entire network of HOA fraud operations across 7 states. Names, account numbers, property transfers, kickback arrangements. Barbara had kept records of everything. The hard drives contained emails and financial records connecting her to 32 other individuals involved in HOA fraud schemes nationwide. It was the largest HOA fraud conspiracy the FBI had ever uncovered. And the cash, $467,000 in small bills. She was planning to run. Agent Rodriguez told me. When your survey exposed her, she knew her operation was compromised. This vault was her escape fund. But there was one more discovery that made national news. Among the documents was a folder labeled Michelle Property Legal Strategy. Inside were detailed plans spanning 20 years showing Barbara's systematic attempts to acquire my father's land through fraud, manipulation, and legal maneuvering. There were forged easement documents she'd never filed, draft quiet title actions, even notes about attempting to have the property declared abandoned through false tax delinquency claims. My father had been right to warn me. Barbara's obsession had consumed her life. Barbara Whitmore's trial began on November 4th, 2024. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she pleaded guilty to 47 federal charges. On January 8th, 2025, she was sentenced to 32 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $14 million in restitution to her victims. Derek Palmer received 15 years. Barbara's sister Helen received 8 years for money laundering. The Metabrook Estates, HOA, underwent complete restructuring. With the FBI's help, the community recovered approximately $840,000 from Barbara's seized assets. Every homeowner who had been defrauded received compensation. Patricia Gonzalez was elected the new HOA president. Her first official act was to issue a formal apology to me on behalf of the community. Michael Torres and 16 other residents who had supported my case organized a community event to thank me for exposing Barbara's crimes. They presented me with a plaque that read, "To Mark Harrison, who stood up for what was right when it wasn't easy." As for my property, I had a decision to make. I could develop it, I could sell it, or I could honor my father's memory in a different way. On March 15th, 2025, I donated 2 acres of my land to the Meadowbrook Estates community as a genuine public park, properly deeded, legally transferred, with no strings attached. I kept 1 acre, including the old oak tree, with my father's carved initials. The community named the park Harrison Memorial Park in honor of my father. The dedication plaque includes his words, "Stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Barbara's elaborate garden was removed. Her fountain, her gazebo, her greenhouse, all of it was demolished. The community voted to replace it with simple walking paths, native plants, and benches where neighbors could gather. Charles Whitmore divorced Barbara and moved to Oregon to live near his daughter. Before he left, he came to thank me personally. "You saved me," he said quietly. "I didn't know it at the time, but you saved me from being complicit in her crimes. Thank you." Today, I visit the park regularly with my daughters. We sit under that old oak tree, and I tell them stories about their grandfather, about his integrity, his foresight, and his quiet determination to do what was right. The carved initials are still there. My father's from 19, and Barbara's from whatever year she deluded herself into thinking the land was hers. I left Barbara's initials there deliberately, not as a memorial to her, but as a reminder that integrity matters, that shortcuts have consequences, that stealing from your community might work for a while, but eventually the truth comes out, and sometimes that truth is buried right beneath your feet. Barbara Whitmore spent 12 years building an empire of fraud, convinced she was too smart to get caught. In the end, it was her own arrogance keeping detailed records, building an underground vault, obsessing over land that was never hers, that destroyed her my fater Knie. Somehow, he knew that holding on to that property would eventually expose the truth. His last words to me weren't about money or family legacy. They were about justice. The park is peaceful now. With children playing where Barbara's stolen fountain once stood, justice was served. But it took years and nearly destroyed a community. Have you ever had to fight back against someone in power who thought they were untouchable? Share your stories below. Your experience might help someone else find the courage to stand up.